Hi, my name is Tom Oberbauer, and I will be speaking to you about the natural wonders of Baja California. I'm traveling down the coast of Baja California with a group of researchers, and we're stopping at a variety of islands. Many of these islands are remote and little visited by people other than fishermen and local inhabitants. Today we're standing on top of a remote mountaintop in the northern end of Cedros Island. Cedros Island is the largest of the California islands, either in Baja California or in California. It's about 23 miles long at the longest and 9 miles wide at the widest. The Native American name for this island is Huamonga, which means Island of Fogs. And as you can see, the fog is just rolling in and out continually while we're standing here. This is an interesting area because the fog establishes forests of pine trees. If you didn't have the fog, the pine trees would not be there. And where we're standing, there are junipers and desert vegetation. It's foggy here, but we don't have pines in here mixed with the desert-like vegetation. The pines seem to sit right at the correct elevation where the fog sits and touches the surface of the earth and provides more moisture. Condensation on the trees provides fog drip and allows for the trees to grow better. So it's kind of almost like the trees are generating their own moisture to allow them to grow. But the trees are also able to germinate even though they don't have fog dripping on them because they could be small trees as they're starting out. In any case, it's an example of the natural wonders you see in this part of the world. In the distance there, you can see there's a grove of pine trees standing surrounded by desert vegetation. These trees grow in a specific spot where the moisture from fog condenses the best. You can see that around those trees there is no forest vegetation. It's basically desert vegetation. There's not anything else nearby that indicates that there is additional moisture in that location. But what happens is that the fog sits and somehow is funneled through and condenses on those trees better than in the locations around it, so that those trees are able to persist. The patch of trees there has probably been there for thousands of years because during the Pleistocene, roughly 9,000, 11,000 years ago, the rainfall was much higher and there were probably more continuous groves of trees in the north part of this island. However, currently the groves are isolated and very distinctly tied to where the fog sits on the mountains, so that the north sides there are ridges with pine trees on them. On the south side it's pure Vizcaino desert vegetation, typical of what you would find in the central part of Baja California. Here you can see the wind blowing up from the ocean, carrying the fog with it, and it hits the ridge top and propels it up higher, slamming into the face of the mountain, providing more moisture in that location than you would find on the leeward side of the mountain. The thing about this island is this kind of a situation where we have the fog rolling up occurs basically every afternoon in the springtime. There are additional pine groves down below us. Similar situation. They're on these little ridge slopes so that the fog hits that side of the slope, condenses moisture, and then as it goes across the leeward side, it doesn't have as much moisture left with it. So you can see that there are patches of pine trees in those locations. Later on, we will walk back down the mountain into the area where there are quite a bit more pines and the density of the forest is quite a bit more significant. It's a very dense forest that extends for a long distance rather than just patches here and there that you see here. This is a view looking across one of the higher northern ridges on the island, right below the highest upper peaks. This area has a transition between a desert, Vizcaino desert type of vegetation up into more of a chaparral type of vegetation. Chaparral is kind of a woody shrubland, whereas the desert vegetation is more open shrubland. The typical species in this area in the transition zone are juniper trees, but then as you go up into the higher elevations, you get into the chaparral. These areas receive between maybe 8, 10, or 12 inches of precipitation a year, but it's augmented by the fog that blows across the upper part of the island, with the 12 inches being the highest parts, and in this particular location maybe 8 inches a year. This is a view back north from the ridge where I'm standing, and those two patches of pine trees in the distance, were part of the pathway to get where I am. I had to hike through those groves all the way down to the bottom of the saddle and then back up to where I'm located here. As you go further north from those pine patches, you get into the more dense forest in Caño de la Mina and that another northern portion of the island where the pine forest is a solid mass on the north-facing slopes. Here's a series of video clips showing the fog blowing across the northern end of the island, and then it will show some video of the fog blowing across the forested areas as well. The highest mountain in the northern central part of the island is Pico Gil at over 3,000 feet high in elevation, and this is a view of that location. On Cedros Island there is an endemic form of the southern mule deer that occurs in Southern California, but this variety is only found on Cedros Island, and the numbers of individuals is considered to be very low, as some people think it may be only a few dozen of the individuals left on the island. The peak in the distance is where I was standing when I filmed the initial introduction to the Cedros Island segment. The next few video clips will be showing some of the spectacular views on the island and some of the beautiful pine forest that exists in the northern part of the island. Southern California and northern Baja California and the adjacent islands are home to a diversity of species in the genus Dudleya. These plants are in the stonecrop family. In this case, the species that we're looking at in front of us, Dudleya pachyphytum with the large, thick leaves, is kind of an extreme example of these. There's also another one directly in front of it with the more needle-like leaves, considered to be Dudleya acuminata. However, there may need to be some additional research to determine exactly which species it is. These plants grow on steep cliffs, northwest facing, where the wind blows, the fog comes blowing against the cliffs, and there are the ocean is down below us. Here's a superior specimen of Dudleya pachyphytum. It's growing in an optimum location so that it can grow in a huge cluster and send up prolific flowering stalks. These flowering stalks are probably arising from the precipitation that came in part of a tropical storm system last October, but additionally with some rainfall that occurred last winter. As I mentioned, these trees are a form of Monterey pine, Pinus radiata, variety cedrosensis. They are trees with serotinous cones, which means that the cones are filled with resin while the tree is growing, and then when a fire comes through, the cones are heated up and the seeds are released. So in essence, the trees reproduce after fires. Sometimes on insular locations like here, the cones will eventually open up and release their seeds so that reproduction can take place in the absence of fire, because under natural conditions, fires in these islands was not a very common occurrence. However, occasionally fires get away nowadays and burn through the forest. In the mid-1990s, there was a large fire that burned through a number of the ridges of pines on the northern part of Cedros Island. The tree behind me is an example of a tree that did not burn in that fire, so that there's a lot of generation of younger trees that are now about 20 years old, but that tree is a larger tree that was pre-existing the fires in the mid-1990s. In the ridge in the distance, you can see a series of very large trees along the skyline. Those are trees that survived the fires, and in the mid-1980s, when I was originally visiting this island, this was the size of all the trees in all of the locations. However, after the fire in the mid-1990s, a lot of those large trees succumbed to the fire. Then they did reproduce. In the foreground, the smaller trees are visible along that first slope before the skyline. Those are trees that are generated from the seeds that were opened by the heating of the fires and the Ceanothus cones, and the trees reproduced. And so those trees are roughly 20 years old, even though they're not very tall. But you can see there's like a mix of the small trees as well as the large trees on this particular slope. And in the far part of the ridge, the larger trees seem to dominate. Some of those trees have trunks that are probably up to 2 feet in diameter. In other parts of the island, there are areas where the large trees had succumbed to the fires, and those large trunks are still laying on the ground. And in the foreground, you can see some of the trunks scattered down below the slope where the younger trees have reproduced. Here you can see a cluster of the cones while they're growing on the trees in their closed situation, where the resin is sealing them shut so that there is no seed release and that the seeds are maintained in a preserved sort of state. When heat is applied to the cones, they will then open up and release the seeds for reproduction. So what happens is a fire comes through, it burns off the duff underneath the trees, the seeds are released, the seeds have mineral soil that they can get their roots into after the next rainfall season, and then they can reproduce. These are remnants of cones that were burned in the mid-1990s fire. They opened up and then they released their seeds. It's been many years since they did that, so that there has been a significant amount of weathering on them to reduce the number of scales and expose a little more of the core part of the cone, but they give you an idea of what the cones look like when they're burned after a fire. This fog-induced forest, with its sharp contrast between desert and forest in a very short distance, is unique in the world for conifers. We have lomas in Chile, you have Oman fog forests, but this is unusual, and there is no place else in the world where you have conifers that come in contact with a desert with such an abrupt straight line. This is not found anywhere else in the world, only here on Cedros Island. On the north end of the island, the major drainage is called Canyon de la Mina, and in the 1920s there was actually a gold and silver mine there. One of the side branches to this major canyon supports Ceanothus verrucosa, or the wart-stem ceanothus. Ceanothus verrucosa occurs in southern San Diego County, and it extends in patchy distribution down to around El Rosario, 100 miles north of Cedros Island. However, there's a disjunct population on Cedros Island in a side canyon off of Canyon de la Mina. And these are views of the plants growing in that location. This is Mammillaria goodridgei. It's an endemic species found on the northern ridge of Cedros Island. It's a member of the fishhook cactus group, where the spines actually have little hooks on the end, and that's why they call it fishhook cactus. This is the mouth of the Grand Canyon on the island. It's the largest canyon on the island. It extends 4.5 miles into the interior, and it flows down from the higher ridges in the central part of the island. Here we have Biopsis Lunada. It's a beautiful silver-leaved shrub with yellow flowers. These flowers only occur right after major rainstorm events, and it could be a good ornamental plant for use in Southern California horticulture. It occurs on Cedros Island and also on Natividad Island. Here we have Eriogonum pondi. It's a type of buckwheat, and it is found only on Cedros and also on Natividad Island. This is a view of the ridge that's to the west of the Grand Canyon in the central part of the island. This in the distance on the top of the ridge, you can see the pines. These are the Cedros Island pines. It's the southern grove that extends in a linear fashion along that ridge, so that when the moisture from the fog hits that face of the ridge, it condenses and helps contribute to the moisture needs for the trees. Here we have Verbicina deceta. It's another one of these yellow-flowered composites in the sunflower family. This one's endemic to Cedros Island. We already talked about Dudleya pachyphyta on the northern part of the ridge. And here we have another Dudleya, Dudleya albiflora. When people think of deserts, they don't normally think of ferns, but here we have Notholina californica, or California cloke fern, growing in the lower canyon portion of Canyon de la Mina on the northern part of the island. This is one of the more spectacular plants that grows on Cedros Island. This is Xylonagra arborea. It's got a monotypic genus. It's a member of the Onagraceae, or the fuchsia family. The upper parts of Cedros Island are preserved for the endemic mule deer and an endemic form of cottontail bunny rabbit. As you climb up from the shore up to the top of Cerro de Cedros, you pass through a number of different vegetation zones and climatic zones. Here you have elephant trees with lichens hanging on them in an area that the fog sits at certain times of the day. I'm sitting on top of Cerro de Cedros. Cedros Island's highest peak is just under 4,000 feet in elevation, and it is an area that receives a little more precipitation than the other parts of the island because of its elevation. On the north side, it has a habitat that's more chaparral-like, and on the south, it still has a very desert-like vegetation. From where we're sitting, it may be visible to see the inversion layer, because we're over the inversion layer, over the fog level that exists. And in the distance, you may be able to see a small grove of Cedros Island pine trees, isolated from the rest, just because of the fog that sits there and helps it persist. This is the north-facing slope on Cerro de Cedros. You can see in front of us is a silk tassel bush on the right and two scrub oaks, one directly on our left and a little further back there's another one. And then there's several more silk tassel bushes down the slope there. Those are indicators of chaparral habitats in Southern California. In the midst of the chaparral and in the chaparral areas after a fire, you have the monkey flower, the Cedros Island monkey flower, Mimulus stellatus. It's considered to be endemic to the island and not found anywhere else in the world. Here we are in the midst of the chaparral on Cerro de Cedros. To our right is Mission Manzanita, Xylococcus bicolor, and to its left, to the brightly lit green leaves, is Laurel sumac, and to the back of that, the whole slope up above is mostly covered with Quercus cedrosensis, or Cedros Island oak. The west coast of the island is a 10-mile long stretch of beach with a coastal plain, as you can see in this video. Just below the highest point of the island, there's a large patch of Sphaeralcia fulva. It's a kind of an apricot mallow type plant, and the orange flowers are quite profuse during good rainfall seasons. Another indicator of chaparral plants is Delphinium cardinale, or red larkspur. It occurs from central California down into Baja California. Probably Cedros is the southernmost extent of its distribution, but it's an indicator of chaparral. Here's another one of the endemic plants on Cedros Island. This is Penstemon cedrosensis. It grows in the higher elevations, mostly in the Cerro de Cedros and in the northern peaks. Here we're looking at the north slope of Cerro de Cedros. The vegetation in the upper slopes of Cerro de Cedros is dominated by a chaparral composed of Xylococcus bicolor, or Mission Manzanita, Quercus cedrosensis, or Cedros Island oak, as well as Rhamnus insula, which is an island redberry. It transitions into a juniper woodland in the lower slopes. But there's also other vegetation, including Ambrosia campharata, which is a ragweed type of plant from the central part of Baja California, and also Laurel sumac, which occurs in California and up to the Los Angeles basin. But here we're turning to where you can see the junipers. The This is another view of the juniper woodland vegetation on the north slope, the lower north slope of Cerro de Cedros. Here's some more views of the chaparral on the north slope of Cerro de Cedros. This is the vegetation around Vargas Spring. These are the native shrubs, including laurel sumac and Rus integrifolia or lemonade berry, and some other plants, toyon, Heteromeles arbutifolia. But much of the area has been inhabited for centuries, so that a lot of the vegetation down below has been affected, including palm trees have been planted and other things. Cedros Island has two large industries. It has a salt processing facility as well as a large abalone cannery. This supports a population of roughly 2,500 people, and here you have the sunset going down over the town of Cedros.